The Seven Heads of Shoth by JM Wyler. In the 53rd year of the furrowing, it came to pass that I, Ramugan, crossed the wastes of Orum and descended into the valley of Shavaz, a land reputed rich for its wide pastures of sheep, fields of sorghum, and groves of flowering trees. It stretched in those days between the mountains of the Kati in the north to the wall of Urtusk in the west, beyond which are said to live the long grey men who sleep within the trunks of trees and speak a barbarous tongue like the babbling of waterfowl. From thence I happened in my wanderings to arrive at the ancient city of Sumeria, which no man of Errol has viewed since the end of the second Raka, and at which I was to sojourn for many weeks as I learned all I could of the distant vale. From the outset, I was struck by the peculiar disposition of the Sumerians. As their city reposed in such a secluded portion of the world, I expected my coming to attract greater interest from its inhabitants. Yet even on the outskirts of their lands, shepherds with their herds and farmers in their fields of flax and barley, unlikely to have seen a traveler for many years, turned their heads at my passing and returned to their labors without a word of greeting. Within the city, shopkeepers with whom I had occasion to barter received reports of the outside world with an indolent disinterest at odds with the ventures of trade. They asked no questions of the realms beyond the Shavaz and returned my own queries with ambivalent replies. Some measure of this reserve extended not just to strangers, but even among the townsfolk themselves, and filled an otherwise placid city with an air of quiet unease. The men of Sumeria wore long-sleeved linen shirts, baggy at the wrists, and trousers similarly puffed at the ankles. They wrapped their forearms in strong cords of leather for a purpose not then known to me and which I only later understood. The women wore dresses of cotton or linen, tie thin belts about their waists, and walk in shoes, sandals, or bare feet according to their occupations. Young maids wore flowers and gemstones in their hair or at their belts, but never fine metals, gold or silver. The city's streets were indifferently kept, and its older buildings and edifices had fallen into ruin, so that humble dwellings of shabby construction sat alongside crumbling manors and the grand remains of broken statuary. So reluctant were the yeomen and tradesmen of the city to speak with me that I nearly despaired of finding any decent lodging which might supply me with equally agreeable company. Yet by slow degrees I was directed in my inquiries to the house of Hiram Nashav, a wealthy planter who owned bountiful fields of plums and almonds in the western reaches of the Shavaz. Singular among his people, he possessed a keen interest in history and was eager to hear my tales of the eastern realms and of the kingdoms beyond the Orum sands. I therefore spent several weeks in his household, reading the obscure histories in the books of his library and talking with my host late into the night. Astronomy and astrology, mathematics and the supernatural, the realms of gods and the petty kingdoms of men, Nashav's roaming intellect traversed and comprehended them all. Few were the subjects of which he was not the master, and there were none of which he was wholly ignorant. Of the many topics we touched upon, only colloquial matters dampened Hiram's scholarly enthusiasm. Although the city of Sumeria possessed marvelous works of marble and stone, Nashav refused to speak of their origin. Weird temples lay scattered about the valley, and a single long wall flanked Sumeria's southern edge. In the center of the city reigned a magnificent fountain, parched of water, but stained deep red with dried blood. In the north stood eerie watchtowers, in which tired sentries stared day and night upon the vacant hills. Nashav gave no answers on the purpose of these wonders, despite all my interest and prodding. He likewise said little on the curious customs of his people, but preferred to keep his thoughts far from the boundaries of the Shavaz. This lapse frustrated my ambitions, for I wished to record the histories of all the western lands, and the legends of Sumeria and its valley were to be a rare jewel in my great work of the world. Nevertheless, my evenings with Nashav compensated me with a trove of knowledge undreamt of in Errol, and better company than I'd met in a dozen nations before or since. Each morning, Nashav went to overlook his holdings in the west, and I wandered the streets of Samira to view its strange architecture and learn more of its curious people. During one such excursion, I chanced upon a grisly scene. From a short distance, I saw 3 men bearing the knotted cords and wide caps of the Samiran magistrate had taken a young child into their custody. As 2 of the men held the child by his arms, the 3rd magistrate repeatedly struck at the boy's back and legs with a strong wooden rod. The beating must have begun some time before I encountered them, for the child's back was beaten bloody, and he sobbed pitifully as one who has already expended the strength of his cries. The boy could not have been more than 8 or 9 years old, yet the townsfolk passed this brutal incident without a single look of concern or word of protest. They went about their business with utter indifference. As I was a stranger in the city and unversed in the customs of Samira, I was hesitant to interfere with the work of its justices. When the flogging showed no signs of abating, however, I stopped a young woman who had just filled a jug of water from a nearby cistern. I gestured her to my side, and she paused, then reluctantly approached, resting the jug of water on her hip with a dull expression on her face. Then, as politely and discreetly as I could, I asked what the child might have done to have earned him such terrible punishment. For a moment, she stood in confusion at my words, and it was only after following my gaze to the work of the magistrates that she seemed to become aware of them at all. Then she looked at me with a blank expression on her face and said simply, "It is the law." A short time later, the magistrates bore the child away, his limbs limp and head lolling silently. Such episodes proved typical of the justice of Samira, where the harshest of punishments seemed to attend the most trivial of crimes. It was never my purpose to pass judgment on the lands I visited, but only to report what I saw with unflinching accuracy. The customs of a kingdom are much like its cuisine. There are many dishes which are novel and agreeable to the taste, some to which one is indifferent, and a few which one finds utterly repugnant or unpalatable. Under normal circumstances, I may have omitted mentioning this episode entirely. It is only in light of what I later learned that I feel bound by a scholar's scruples to put the incident to ink. This barbarous scene, and others like it, did little to blunt the enjoyment of my stay. So long as I remained within the walls of Nashav's villa, I was permitted to spend my days at ease and without worries. It was only after many weeks that I began to feel the importunities of time, and knew the day quickly approached when I must leave my learned host and continue on my westward journey. An early autumn would soon fade to winter, and I sought to reach the southern passes of the Tarabi before snows had blocked the mountains. And so one evening, after my host returned from a review of his fields and had joined me in his parlor, I thanked him for his generosity and told him of my intention to return to the road as early as the day after the morrow. My words sorely grieved Nashav, and he remonstrated, "I would far prefer you stay through the winter at least, if not to avoid the vagaries of the road, than to provide an old philosopher with a little debate and conversation through the dull months of cold." Naturally, I was conscious of the great honor my host conferred on me by this offer, yet the design of my work would brook no delay in my departure. I replied, "I fear my idle tales would weary you before those months had found their close. Even so, I would gladly accept your offer and consider the time well spent. But I have many countries left to visit and thousands more leagues to cross before I complete my catalogue of the Western realms. Until such time as my labors are finished, I cannot allow myself to tarry long in any country, no matter how fine the lodgings nor agreeable the company." My host appeared adequately convinced of my earnestness, and did not attempt to press the issue further, but lifted his palm, saying, "I know better than to attempt to coax a man from his duty, so tell me only the day of your departure, and I will see that my servant Kapali provides all that you require." To which I shook my head, saying, "Today I purchased all the supplies I require, and am already too far in your debt for your generosity these many weeks. Yet before I leave, I must ask your advice concerning the route of my journey," which advice my host readily assented to give if it was in his power to do so. I therefore continued, saying, "I am no scholar, but if I am not much mistaken, these lands and your city of Sumeria fall within the domain of the god Shoth, called Shoth of the Seven Heads by ancient tradition." Hiram's hand shook, and he briskly set down his cup of chafa tea, rattling on its porcelain plate. So startling was his reaction that I immediately worried I had touched upon some unspoken taboo. But Nashav soon recovered his bearing, and reclining in his chair, cleared his throat and said, "I'm surprised you know this name, for I never spoke it, nor I dare say have any of my fellow townsmen." It shames me to relate that I chuckled at his words, prideful of my long studies, which had prepared me with such an abundance of knowledge on these matters. I replied with a modest bend of my head, "The name is known to me, yes, though few others in Errol have ever heard it. I read his name once among the Table of Gods in the Doroganum of Enith, and he is also written of in the High Boliath, incomplete as our copies of that work may be." Nashav took up his tea once more and replied in a formal, academic tone, "It is true that Shavaz and all the valleys between the Kati Mountains in the north and the peaks of Tarabi in the south are ruled by such a god, though we do not often speak of him. I wonder what your old books said of this god, our Shoth of the Seven Heads." "Very little, I must admit," I replied in embarrassment. "The Doroganum records only his name and the realms of his purview among a catalogue of the deities known to men. The High Boliath is rumored to contain a more detailed account of him, though the fragments of the book we possess in the East are hardly more illuminating than the Doroganum. They report only that the many heads of Shoth form a single deity, and that the god is disobeyed at one's peril." "Well, your books spoke aright on those points," said Hiram in a strange, ironic tone. "The little they did speak. Yet I must ask you, to what purpose do you inquire after the god Shoth? Of what interest is our city's god to you?" I was somewhat taken aback by the suspicious undertone in Nashav's words, who had never taken offense at any other line of questioning, no matter how trifling or delicate the subject matter. I therefore quickly explained, saying, "Only this. I will soon resume my journey and must travel many hundreds of leagues before the next great city on roads unknown to me which pass through the domains of your lord, Shoth. On such occasions a traveler is wise to seek out the local deities and do homage to them and make offerings for a safe passage through their lands. It is a practice I have ever followed and which has sustained me in good luck and health through a lifetime of travel." "I had guessed that your reasons were such," said Nashav, "yet I must tell you that in this instance it is absolutely out of the question, and if I suspected that you had come to our city with the sole aim of finding Shoth, I should throw you from my household and call for the magistrate. No, no, be at ease. I have learnt enough of you these past weeks to know this not to be the case." I replied, "I must say I am astonished at the earnestness of your refusal. If I have trespassed against some local custom, I assure you I was not aware." "Nothing of the sort," said Hiram, "but the explanation is not a simple story. I know you are a widely traveled man. Now tell me, has this city of ours and its habits ever struck you in any way peculiar?" I replied, "I confess that the ways of your city did appear at times inexplicable to my eyes. But as you say, I have seen many kingdoms in my travels and have encountered a great number of strange practices. As I have found that one nation's customs are seldom like those of another, I had no wish to pry into chambers which might reveal sensitive subjects." "Not at all," said Nashav. "There are no taboos against speaking of our practices. We merely loathe doing so. However, it is our law that none shall seek out Shoth, nor even venture north of the city towards the hills of Akat in which he dwells." I replied, "I did note the watchtowers on the north and the mouldering estates in that quarter of the city. They seemed at odds with the peaceful seclusion of your country, and I guessed them to be the relics of some ancient conflict. Yet far from settling the matter in my mind, your words do more to pique than slake my curiosity. For a collector of legends and histories such as myself, You must know how vexing it is to have mysteries left unresolved." Nashav replied, "I can allay your anxiety on that matter at once. Tonight I will tell you all I know of the story, or at least that which is fitting to tell. I had always planned on doing so before you left our valley. Gather your quills and parchment, for there may not be another chance to tell this history before our people are stricken from the earth." Hearing this, I went to collect my quills and parchments and rejoined my host in his parlor. Nashav's servants had kindled a warm blaze in the hearth, lit candelabras suitable for writing, and uncorked a bottle of fine red wine of excellent vintage. Nashav bid me drink however much I liked, but drank only a half-glass himself, before returning to his favored tea. Thus prepared, my host began his tale. It may interest you to know that the present Sumerians were not the first to inhabit this valley, which was formerly called Shoth. When our people arrived, it had long been occupied by a sunken and degraded race called the Jatavites, who had allowed their once grand monuments and pavilions to fall into ruin, and who practiced every sort of debauchery and iniquity with no regard for consequence or decency. Nor were the Jatavites the original settlers of the land, but had displaced a far older people whose name and description are entirely forgotten. What came before these, I think nothing shall ever be known. These Jatavites kept many strange customs which bewildered our ancestors. They forbade the use of implements of tin or the measurement of time, and inflicted gruesome punishments on their transgressors. Before these Jatavites were lost to antiquity, we Sumerians also learned of their god Shoth, who rules this valley of Shavaz, and of whom the Jatavites spoke with an incongruous blend of fear, contempt, and vicious mockery. We took these blasphemies as proofs of the Jatavites' general depravity, yet it must be admitted that any law which their tradition ascribed to their god Shoth, they obeyed with absolute fidelity. As the numbers of the Jatavites dwindled, our own ancestors likewise made prudent obeisance to Shoth as the rightful lord of the valley, but never sought him out, nor ventured into the hills of Akat in the north, which the Jatavites claimed for his abode. Several centuries ago, however, a vast storm broke over the Shavaz, and rains fell upon our people like a sea draining from the sky. The river Una overflowed its banks, the foundations of our granaries crumbled into the currents, and most of our harvest was washed away. We survived that winter under many hardships, yet a famine had taken root before the next sowing. It was then that our people began to think of the god Shoth, the proper sovereign of these lands. Many believed he could alleviate our suffering, and some argued it was our negligence of the god which had brought the storms down upon us, for we had never made offerings at his abode in Akat, nor built temples to his honor. Knowing the Jatavites had titled him Shoth of the Seven Heads, we sent a delegation of 7 members, a learned elder, 2 strong men, 1 fine youth, and 3 young maids, unsure what sort of supplicants would best please the deity. For 3 days they wandered through the hills of Akat, along hoary stone paths overgrown with nettles and ragweed. Then, on the 3rd morning, they came upon a clearing with a great stone pillar, carved with cultic runes and weathered with age. While they rested there, the ground suddenly shook, and they heard a loud crack of timber as the trees in the east began to split and fall to the ground. Then 3 grotesque heads emerged from the canopy atop thick necks like the bodies of pythons. The god lumbered into the clearing on massive tufted hooves, revealing 4 more heads resting on various parts of its furred torso. Unprepared as the delegation was for such a sight, they had steeled their nerves to truck with a god, and did not flee in terror. Would that they had. Our city elder stepped forward and made trembling obeisance, while the maids laid offerings at Shoth's bestial feet. Then the leftmost head, shaped like a crocodile grinning, spoke thus: "Purchase marble from the Kati over the mountains, and build a marble fountain 40 cubits on each side, and 30 cubits tall. Feed it no water, but on the first whole moon of every spring, slake its thirst with the blood of ewes. Then return to us when the work is complete, for the word of Shoth is absolute, and the heads of Shoth are one. A strange formula and bizarre request. Marble is bought dearly in these valleys and difficult to transport over the mountains. Yet many in Samira felt the arduous task a payment due for our long years of impiety. Arrangements for its construction began immediately. As a curious aside, the youth from that day lost all memory of his life before that hour, even of his mother and father and siblings. He is reputed to have lived many times the lifespan of a mortal man. Another man in this entourage was cured of a petty toothache. One maiden grew back into a child, and another's hair changed to brilliant red. Curious gifts from a god. Now the building of the required fountain took 8 years to complete, and on the spring of the 9th, it received its first ablution of blood. Thereafter, our city sent a second entourage to Shoth with a similar complement of votaries. The god returned to the clearing in a cat, and a new elder stepped forward from our ranks. But Shoth raised a taloned finger to one of the young maidens from our number and beckoned her to approach. She stepped forward, made obeisance, and in a frightened voice told the monstrous god that the great fountain was complete. Then a head like an ugly crone bent towards her on its thick stalk of a neck. Beneath a mat of filthy hair it cackled, "Build a wall to the south of the city, 10 cubits high, mounted by iron braziers at every 30 paces. Light fires in the braziers, and keep them aflame from the first frost of winter till the first bloom of spring. Return to us when the work is done. The word of Shoth is absolute, and the heads of Shoth are one." Our delegation withdrew, and it is said that the maiden who spoke to Shoth on this occasion later married and bore her husband triplets 4 times in succession. Another supplicant found a chest of gold and precious gems while tilling his field. Peculiar facts to relate, yet well attested to by witnesses. Meanwhile, the people of Samira grumbled under their new obligation. The time of the famine had long passed, and many of the young had no experience of want or deprivation. The more pious among us argued the wall might serve some purpose yet undivined, foretelling a shadowy conflict with the southern realms. Hence the construction of the wall proceeded, but in a slow and desultory manner which took 7 years to complete. That winter, our people lit the braziers of the southern wall for the first time. When we extinguished them the following spring, Samira once more planned its homage to the bestial god, nor were volunteers lacking to make the journey into Akkat's grey hills. Our people had seen the strange gifts Shoth had bestowed upon his supplicants, and the streets swelled with prospective votaries. In all, 50 men and women of Samira, ardent followers of Shoth, were selected in a grand jubilee. Celebrations continued to the day of their departure, and our devotees ventured into Akkat to the cheers of our people and a train of gifts and offerings. They gathered in Shoth's glade, then danced and sang at the god's feet with promiscuous abandon. Then Shoth spoke from a face with 3 eyes and a snout like a hyena, saying, "Let any man or woman of the city found partaking of meat on the 3rd day of the week be stricken with rods until their bodies lose all strength. Return to us after the law has stood 3 years. The word of Shoth is absolute, and the heads of Shoth are one." Now this abjuration the people of Samira found strange and unreasonable, yet at the behest of our magistrates it was followed for some time with rigid discipline. That is, for many months none were seen to eat such fare on the 3rd day of any week. Yet as autumn drew to a close, an old widow was seen eating a soup of mutton on the 3rd day, and a pious member of the public brought her before the magistrate. In her words, she was an old woman with grown children of her own, and had no patience for the dictates of weird and beastly gods. Still, the embarrassed magistrates were obliged to enforce the law of Shoth. and so the woman was duly punished. Yet they made their strikes with a light hand, which gave the widow little discomfort. The next morning an earthquake shook the valley, unlike any we had ever witnessed. It leveled our city and toppled our monuments, leaving 13 Cimmerians crushed beneath the rubble, including the offending woman's eldest daughter. Thereafter the law was enforced in full. These events blunted the enthusiasm of our people for their inscrutable God. His pious acolytes claimed the woman and magistrates were entirely to blame, for the law was easy to bear, and punishment was the natural right of gods. The gifts which Shoth had bestowed on the members of the procession on that occasion had been likewise ambiguous. He granted to 3 of our number the facility to see in the dark as cats do, yet 2 others he struck forever blind. To a few he granted wealth, and some he made destitute. The Cimmerians presumed it was payment for their secret sins. Yet our next reception of Shoth was greatly diminished in number. A mere 24 proceeded to the glade of Akat after a short ceremony. They gathered before Shoth's obelisk and were greeted by the head of a blue shoebill stork with pale, nictitating eyelids that blinked over curious avian eyes. From its dark, broad beak, it squawked, "Dig a pit, 20 paces to a side, and 50 cubits deep. Cast into its depths any who wear a metal adornment after the 3rd hour of night. The word of Shoth is absolute, and the heads of Shoth are one." At this point, I interrupted my host, saying, "I do not mean to sound skeptical of your tale, but very early in our acquaintance, I showed you the ring I bear on my left hand from the Academy of Taran, which any can plainly see is forged of iron and silver, nor do I ever remove the ring except to bathe." Even as I spoke these words, a small part of me feared my host had never noticed this grievous infraction of their laws, and that being informed of his error, Nashav would at once call for the magistrate, and that I would be cast headlong into Shoth's vile pit. Only the morbid tenor of Shoth's history could have ever suggested to my mind such terrible perfidy from my gracious host. But Hiram only inclined his head and smiled, saying, "We have learned throughout the centuries that Shoth's injunctions extend only to the peoples to whom they are given. For example, you must surely have noticed that whatever arcane laws were given to the Jatavites or their predecessors, they were never binding to us Cimmerians." I replied, "I apologize for my doubts, but as a writer of histories I cannot allow myself to accept any narrative uncritically, but must always examine the consistency of its parts." "A principle of which I wholly approve," said Nashav. He then continued, saying, "From the time the law of the pit was enacted, several Cimmerians have been each year thrown into the chasm. A drunk who oversleeps the hour, or a woman who forgets to remove an earring before bed. Once, a group of young women stayed late at a festival and neglected to remove their jewelry after nightfall. Our magistrates attempted to elide the punishment and made specious excuses for their pardon. The next night, fire fell from the sky, and the city burned for 3 days. As it happens, the man who addressed Shoth on this last occasion was a tanner who had lost his wife and intended to solicit the god for her restoration. Afterwards, he was able to see, or so he claimed, the shades of the numberless dead wandering aimlessly upon the earth. The tanner said their ranks filled the avenues like grass in a meadow, and he thereafter retired to his rooms and lived out the remainder of his life in the dark. So much for the gifts of gods. Our people now anticipated the next visit to Shoth with trepidation, dreading what new and onerous demand the monstrous god might place upon them. Many in Cimmera clamored against sending any delegation whatsoever, but the command to return had formed part of the god's injunction, and none wished to hazard Shoth's wrath. Even so, only 5 supplicants were found willing to return to Shoth's glade. As it happened, the fears of the Cimmerians proved justified. After their visit to the god, none of the 5 were able to speak again, except to repeat the words which Shoth spoke to them that day. By gestures they related that the head which addressed them was that of the horned ram, and its command was as follows: "Let no mortal born in the Shavaz settle outside the bounds of the valley, lest they perish. Return in 10 years with obedience." The god then bid them return in 5 years. Nashav sighed. Unfortunately, the boundary described by Shoth's law was subject to some uncertainty. In the succeeding summer, entire households of Sumerans living in the hills on the edge of the valley died under mysterious circumstances. Here, I must once again break my host's narrative, for after the 5th envoy, Hiram grew pensive, and my quill hovered restlessly over the parchment. Nashav set aside his tea, leaned back in his chair, and studied the fire as it crackled behind its grate. For several minutes, I watched my writing candle nibble away its wick, and I thought perhaps my host had grown weary and wished to retire. But then his voice resumed, somber and deep, and with his gaze fixed on the fire, he told of Shoth's 6th head, which was like the mummified remains of a human man, with a voice dry and rasping. Yet as for Shoth's 6th decree, Nashav refused to speak it. This naturally aroused my curiosity, and I inquired if the prohibition against speaking of this law formed any part of the decree itself, to which Hiram replied in the negative, saying that even the lowest savages would deem the god's new law unfit for words. Indeed, I was not informed of its nature except in the most ambiguous terms, and swore an oath which Nashav demanded of me that I would never attempt to discover the contents of Shoth's 6th decree, nor ever speak or write them should they become known to me. An oath I keep only too willingly, for the little I had gleaned of Shoth's injunction filled me with such revulsion that I wonder how such a city did not crumble in self-loathing. Nashav returned to his tale with half-closed eyes, and in the darkening hour his features grew sallow and long. The shadows painted his face, and he appeared then, not like a man in the prime of his age, but haggard and lined, as one who has far outlived life's joys. The 6th head neglected to demand our return to Akkat, and for a time we hoped our troubles had ended. Yet the cycles of Shoth were to repeat twice more. Twice, a man or woman of Sumer stole into the hills of Akkat against our prohibitions and begged miracles of the god in exchange for unspeakable services. Each instance began a new cycle of injunctions against our people. In a score of years we found ourselves bound to the god by 12 new rites, and as Shoth's mandates multiplied, we became a shadow of our former prosperity. At the end of the 3rd cycle, the people of Sumer grew grim, and we resolved never to allow our god to command us again. The smiths of Sumer turned their craft to the forging of crude pylons, and the hands of farmers, calloused from the plough, took up spears and hunting bows. So when the appointed hour came to return to Shoth, in place of a procession of acolytes, an angry multitude 1,000 strong marched on the hills of Akkat. Our townsfolk with grim faces and worried eyes. We watched the clouds in fear of falling brimstones and distrusted the ground at our feet, lest Shoth break apart the earth and swallow up our meager band in an instant. Yet an eerie stillness laid on the woods of Akkat, and the march of 3 days passed in utter silence. When we at last arrived at Shoth's glade, our numbers swelled beyond the clearing, and with spears drawn, we awaited the coming of our terrible god. He arrived with the shafts of the noontime sun, brushing apart the trees like reeds in a river. Now we stood trembling with our hands upon our spears, and Shoth surveyed our army with myriad eyes. Then we watched in horror as the 7th head emerged from the monster's side, more grotesque and disfigured than any before. Its face protruded from the god's body like a swollen boil and twisted in a series of agonized expressions. Then, like an animal unused to human speech, it slowly curled its lips and croaked, "Return to your city and never venture again into the hills of Shoth, lest we command you once more. The word of Shoth is absolute, and the heads of Shoth are one. Yet of the 7 heads, I alone am sane." Then someone in his fright or anger loosed an arrow towards the god, and it struck Shoth upon the witch's neck. Thick red blood spurted from its scaly throat, and the crone laughed a mad, cackling laugh. The hyena joined her in syncopated squeals, and then the ram and the crocodile. We loosed our arrows one and all then, and they fell like rain on the chimeric god. His burbling laughter grew until it filled the little vale and drowned our voices in a cacophony like a slaughterhouse. The mummified skull opened its crumbling jaw, and a deep and hideous bellow spread across the valley until it echoed above the walls of Samira. The 7th head, its eyelids dripping crimson, closed its eyes and gibbered with pain. Shoth never lifted a hand in defense. As the heads of the god laughed and chortled, we hacked its body to pieces. Desperate and mad, we ripped and tore its flesh, till the hot red blood had soaked the tunics of every man and ran in a river down the hills of Akut. Yet the heads themselves remained unscathed. We hacked them from their serpentine throats and tore them laughing from the body. The impression of blades and arrows melted from the monstrous faces, and neither fire nor drowning could quench their insatiable laughter. We carried the heads into the city, sealed them in iron boxes, and buried 6 in obscure corners of the hills of Akut and the Kati Mountains. Yet headless as he is, Shoth's laws retain all of their potency, and to this day the smallest neglect of his decrees brings destruction upon our city. After Nashav finished his tale, silence filled the space between us for some time. Then he called for his servant Kapali and spoke a few words to him in the Sumeran tongue. Kapali left the room, and Nashav reached into his robes and withdrew a thick brass key, which he placed on the stand beside him. "I know you doubt much of what I have told you, for even a traveler such as yourself, who has seen many strange things, must find these events wondrous, even impossible to hear. Yet I would grant you the means to confirm all that I have said, should you desire it." Kapali soon returned, bearing a large iron box, carved with occult symbols and sealed with a heavy lock. He set the heavy box on the stand by Nashav's side, and my host placed his hand upon the lid and said, "This box holds the 7th head of Shoth. You spoke before of your wish to repay my generosity. What I ask now will more than repay the balance. I ask you to take the 7th head from this valley and bury it in some unknown, distant place. Yet I give you the key as well, for I know your curiosity and know how impatient you are with rumor and hearsay. The 7th head alone will do you no harm. It speaks only truth and nothing else. But if you unlock the box and speak to the god, it will tell you something you do not wish to know, something which will haunt you to the end of your days." Stunned, I was unable to form a coherent reply, and my host rose and excused himself to his chambers. Long into the night, I sat alone, staring at the strange reliquary beside his empty chair. The next day, my host sent Kapali with his regrets that he felt unwell and was too ill to leave his chambers. I bore away the box before sunrise on the 2nd morning after and never saw my host again. Nor since that day have I ever returned to the city of Samira or the valley of Shavaz. I still hold the key to the 7th head of Shoth.